Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we're here for my play-ins Day 3 overview and analysis video. Finally, we get to some games that, all of them obviously have mattered up until this point, but this is a pretty big day for these games. It's going to be the winners finals in both the A bracket and the B bracket. We will know at the end of the day today which two teams are going to be the number 1 seeds coming out of the first part of the play-ins, and we'll be given side selection in a best of 5 to see who gets out of the group. So very, very big games coming in on both sides, and I'm incredibly excited for it. Of course, if you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. Let me know who you thought was going to win, what you thought was going to happen. Of course, if at any point throughout the video you find yourself enjoying it, I really, really would appreciate if you left a like and hit subscribe. I'm not going to preach to you too much about it, but we're so close to some milestones, and obviously we put a ton of time and effort into this world's content. If you are enjoying it, if you find yourself enjoying it as you watch it, it really would mean a lot if you hit those buttons. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. We got 2 series to cover here today. Still best of 3, so no best of 5s just yet, but still very, very important games, and we get to kick it off with our Bracket A finals, our winners finals, I guess I should say, of Bracket A. Of course, it's a very, very fun one, a matchup between the number 1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon and the number 1 seed from the CB LOL in Loud. These are 2 of my favorite teams, if not my 2 favorite teams in the play-in stage, both sides of the bracket. I've always talked about how A side has been significantly stronger, and I definitely still believe that. Both of these teams looking really good in the first round. PSG, very clinical, very calculated, exactly what we expected in their matchup against R7. They were a team that, as long as they don't completely throw things away in the early game, they should have the consistency to be able to win basically anything after 20 minutes. They're the best team-fighting team in the play-in stage, and it's not particularly close. They have a lot of really talented players as well that don't really lose at all, and so it's a really tough circumstance to try and play into PSG and feel good about it, because their players are just super talented and very mistake-less, if you will. They're just very consistent, very, very good players that, are going to consistently give you the same thing every game. Now, if they are going to struggle, sometimes that's going to be against early aggression, and luckily for Loud, that's exactly what they offer as a team. They are a very fast, very aggressive, and quite talented team. They have a very intriguing playstyle that I think matches up, at least relatively interestingly, into PSG. They play quite a lot through their jungle and through their bot lane, which I think is definitely a positive against PSG. The bot lane, in my opinion, is probably the weakest part of PSG's, structure. Wacko and Woody, I think, are good players, but they're not exceptional like Gen.G, Maple, and Aji at times can be, and so, Root or Seos can really, step up and perform the same way that they did in the first round against Gam, where they were really the strength of the team. That's going to be massive. Root in particular was awesome in that first series. Obviously, getting the first pentakill of Worlds is a great thing, but if he's going to be able to keep that up, if he's going to be able to be a carry that this team can dump resources into early and he can, pay them back out towards the back half of games, that's huge. Everybody who's watched the channel knows how I feel about Seos. I think he's probably the best support in the play-in stage, one of the most underrated players in the entire world, and Tinones fits really well into this team because he's really good at giving up resources. He's a very consistent and strong laner, especially early, but he does like to shove and roam. He does like to move around the map. That's kind of his style, and I do think it fits this team well. I think Croc versus Gen.G is definitely going to be an interesting matchup to watch. It's going to be interesting to see which one of those two can come out on top. But, I think this is going to be a fun series. I talked about it being relatively 50-50 in yesterday's kind of preview of today, and I still believe that. I picked PSG to win this series because I do think that they are the better team. They are the more talented team, but if Loud took it, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I think it's going to be a fun one, but of course, if you're new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I will be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in the series, and at the end of each series, I'll be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice little bow. We'll quickly preview our Day 4 games at the end of the video as well, but let's go ahead and jump right into it. We've previewed PSG and Loud. It's time to jump into game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was PSG Talon. They are going to take the first game of the series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is what you wanted to see from PSG. We talked about the ways that they could strike against this Loud team, which is just to stay calm, cool, and collected. Loud doesn't necessarily adapt to that particularly well. They're very used to, especially domestically, generating large leads in the early game and not really having to worry about playing from behind, but that's not what happened in this game. PSG did a really good job in draft, in my opinion, of cultivating this like idea that they could play through very early on. Their early game is very strong here, especially the top side of the map, which we will talk about, and it did allow them to get a ton of pressure. Obviously, we'll talk about it, but Loud really struggled in terms of the execution down the stretch of this game, and this was the concern with them. If you watched my primer video before Worlds, going into this tournament, my big concern with Loud was their execution going to be good enough when they aren't in advantageous situations? And unfortunately, the answer to that question, really the first time it's been asked in 2023, was no. It wasn't very good in this game, but credit to PSG for doing exactly what they do, which is slow the pace of the game down, generate small leads over and over again, and then just dominate team fights. Really start to take things, full throttle after 20 minutes. Player of the game for me, though, is going to go to Gen.G in the jungle. I love Gen.G. I ranked him as the number 10 jungler at this tournament, which is the highest I ranked anybody from a minor region. It's not particularly close. I think that he is pretty easily the best player in any minor region in the world right now. It's unfair that he is as good as he is and he's playing in the PCS. I think that, obviously he's had some time in the LPL and he's done relatively well for himself there as well, but Gen.G continues to look like an absolute madman. Jarvan continues to rise up my priority list in terms of the picks that you have to watch. There are a lot of, champions that I think people really hyped up a lot before Worlds that haven't necessarily looked as dominant as maybe I would want to see them. Things like the Orianna come to mind that everybody was telling me is like super broken, and it just hasn't necessarily translated to that. Talia on the other side of this map, I think, has been getting some hype in that direction. Jarvan was getting it as well, and Jarvan is the one that has really been like, okay, no, Jarvan's really strong. Like, he is clearly super effective at what he does. I always considered him kind of a souped-up version of a champion like Vi, where he's consistently going to be going in, and you obviously want to be able to generate those early leads with him so that he doesn't become just completely squishy in the late game, but he offers a ton of utility, and he pairs up really well with a lot of the other champions that are strong in the current meta, and I think Gen.G obviously played him incredibly proactively in this game. Gen.G is not the fastest jungler in the world. In fact, his strength is that he doesn't really make mistakes in the early game. You pretty much know what you're going to get out of him from a game-to-game basis, but the Jarvan was very active in the early game, and I think him moving around the map and creating a lot of those advantages was super advantageous for PSG. I want to give a shout out to Maple as well. Talked about Gen.G and Maple being awesome as a duo and really working well together, them being the best jungle mid duo in my opinion in the play-in stage, and that continues to come to fruition. Maple is awesome. His laning this game was fantastic. I really like the Nico into Talia matchup. I think Nico is a champion that will continue to see priority. We saw her pretty much exclusively paired with Nocturne down the stretch of a lot of the summer split, and I thought that was kind of a waste of what Nico was offering. I talked about that quite a bit. It was a waste of what Nocturne was offering in that same vein. I think both of them just kind of got pigeonholed into this wombo combo ideology. I think Nico is a lot more versatile than that, and I think Maple showed that off in this game, moving around with the Jarvan, creating a lot of action, getting Wacko ahead on the Xayah, getting Aji ahead on the Gnar. Like I talked about, I like this draft on the top side. I think Gnar is very good right now, and I think underrated as a pick into something like Renekton. And obviously Jarvan plus Nico is just going to be stronger than Sedge plus Talia in the early game in the isolated 2v2s, and taking advantage of that was really good for PSG. Wacko and Woody did a good job of not losing. I know that's a weird thing to say when you're playing Xayah into Sivir, because generally speaking, you would think that Xayah would do well in that matchup, but I actually like Sivir here, especially if Sejuani does want to spend some time in the bot lane. I think that Woody did a really good job in particular of taking the Rel and really making use of her ability to just kind of threaten and position really aggressively so that you can kind of dissuade a lot of the aggressive thoughts. I think Jarvan plus Rel is a very difficult combo to deal with, especially when you've got a Nico or a Gnar on the backline that can also follow up. And Loud's pretty immobile. Like, they do have some mobility, but in general, there are a lot of, a lot of squishy targets available for PSG to go on. And I think in general, this all just kind of culminates in a nice PSG win that I think they looked good in. And then for Loud on the other side, this was concerning. This is definitely at least a little bit of a red flag, because Loud really doesn't lose in the early game, and so we never really knew what they were going to look like when they had to play, super far from behind, and in the early stages of kind of testing that out, it's not necessarily been good for them. This was not a good look. Croc was miserable in this game. There really is no other way to put it. He's done of the game, and it's very obvious. It felt like his mental just got completely destroyed by the end of this game. He was whiffing Sejuani ultimates, consistently going in and dying without the rest of his team, just out of position in the jungle, not placing any wards. He had the lowest vision score on the team, I believe. It felt like mentally he just completely imploded, and if that's going to continue over to the final games of this series, then Loud's going to be in trouble, because Croc is a really big part of what they do as a team. He's very active in the early game, and setting up his laners is something that Loud has really kind of capitalized on. Tinones is a good player, but he's not someone that really likes to play for himself. He likes to play for the rest of the team, and Root, I like Root as a late game carry, but he's not exactly been the most stable in terms of generating his own 2v2 leads, and so Croc's very important towards how this team wants to play and the ideology of where they want to play through, and him playing like this is disaster for Loud. This is one of the worst games that we've seen at Worlds this year, and that's a pretty high bar considering how bad some of these players have played, but Croc was miserable, and again, if he's going to play like this, it's pretty doomed. But I don't think the rest of the team really stepped up. Robo, Root, and Seos, I think, were fine. They certainly generated their own leads. Robo, in particular, I think had a good game, and Robo's solid. He's been really good internationally, basically every time that Loud has gone international. And then Root and Seos, I think, are solid, but Tinones really couldn't do all that much on the Talia. He lost in the isolated 1v1 to Maple, and Maple was significantly more active on the map, which is certainly something to keep an eye on, but in general, I think Loud just needs to go back to the well and go to what kind of got them here in the first place, which is early game aggression, putting themselves in a position where they can play a little bit more aggressive on the map and really allow their mid game to kind of separate them. If you get to the late game relatively neutral, you're just not going to be as good as PSG, and I think we kind of found that out here. So definitely a big swing game in Game 2 because it could be the end of this series. Can PSG close it out in 2 games, or is Loud going to send us to a game number 3 in this best of 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was PSG. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to clean sweep this best of 3, 2-0, and they have now officially qualified for a best of 5 to get out of the play-in stage. Congrats to PSG. I don't think this is really a big surprise to a ton of people. I thought PSG was a really, really good team going into this tournament. There was a reason they were the only minor region team to be in my C tier and not below that in one of the D tiers. Even if I did like Loud or GAM or even some of these other teams, even a team like R7 that I was high on, I didn't have any of them in the C tier. I had PSG in the C tier, and it was for reasons like this. It just feels like they are a much more complete team than any of those other teams at the tournament, and they definitely showed that out in this series. They played through everybody. Everybody really showed up in game number 2. If game 1 was kind of a game where Loud kind of lost the plot, especially as things got further and further along into the game, game 2 was one where they never had the plot in the first place. Their jungler was still clearly very mental boomed, and the rest of their team really underperformed. I think their draft really let them down, and I think in general PSG was very clearly better. So let's talk about it. Player of the game for me in game 2 is going to go to Wacko in the bot lane. Awesome game from him on the Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa has already proven to be incredibly strong at this tournament. I would imagine good teams see that and continue to try and prioritize her more than a lot of these other AD carries. We've been seeing other ADCs, highly prioritize. Xayah, obviously, for good reason. I like Xayah and has a very favorable matchup into Kai'Sa, but things like the Sivir for Root on the other side that he played 2 games in a row of, just don't love that from the side of Loud. And I think in general, especially if you're going to give over both Rel and Kai'Sa, you really need to make sure that you're in a spot to be able to do something elsewhere on the map. And that's just not what Loud did. Loud drafted a Malphite, not a Maokai, and they drafted Kha'Zix, which is just super, super aggressive, super risky, and not something I think you can get away with if you are definitely the worst team in a game like this. But credit to Wacko, I think in particular, his positioning this game was spectacular, especially down the stretch in the back half of this game once he had already gotten a ton of kills. He knew exactly where he was supposed to be and how he was supposed to play once he was a ridiculously fed Kai'Sa. And there are a lot of players that play this situation way too safe because Kai'Sa doesn't have a ton of tools to be able to get herself out of trouble. Wacko, I think, did a really good job of playing aggressive when he knew he could get away with it. Of course, credit to Woody as well for a lot of those Rel engages, especially early. The first 10 minutes of the game were fantastic from him. Rel is another champion that I would expect to continue to rise in popularity as this tournament goes on because of just how good she is at the moment. But player of the series for me as a whole pretty much has to go to Gen.G. He was so phenomenal across both of these games. On the Viego here, he was very, very solid. In the mid game, he did a really good job of opening up skirmish opportunities for the rest of the team to be able to play. And that's super important because when you look at these two comps, I would say the only part of the game where I would be concerned for PSG would be in the mid game. I don't love how their team kind of works in the mid-game. I think Kennan's not necessarily online yet. That's probably Viego's weakest part of the game, and Kai'Sa's certainly not at the point, typically, where you're going to be able to dominate. You've got pieces for Loud that can create a lot of panic and a lot of confusion with Malphite ult, with Kha'Zix jumping in, with Nico, shenanigans. I think that there are a lot of opportunities, and so for Gen.G to be the best player in the mid-game was so crucial and so important for how PSG ended up winning this game. So credit to Gen.G, credit to everybody on this team. Maple was solid on the LeBlanc. Aji destroyed Robo this game on the Kennen, but that's what you get for picking Malphite into Kennen. We'll get into that. I really don't get it. I don't get the idea behind that pick on B5, but credit to Aji. This was probably his best game of the tournament, but everybody on PSG just looks really good. Their style, I think, very much translates towards beating teams that they are just more talented than. And I think you can make a case that that is everyone else in the play-ins, especially with BDS not necessarily performing up to their level right now. So credit to PSG. They looked fantastic here, and they're moving on. And And then for Loud, of course, their tournament's not over. They are going to move into one more best of 3 against either GAM or R7, and if they are able to win that, they will get a best of 5 still. They just won't be able to get side selection for it, and that's okay. Loud's still in an okay spot. I just think some of their weaknesses have kind of been exposed with a series like this. I think in particular, their draft in Game 2 was very aggressive, and not something that I think they could possibly get away with. I think this is very ego-checky in terms of the draft. I think the Kazakhs in particular is very ego-checky, and I think the Malphite is just hubris. Like, I don't really know what you're going for there. Robo's gonna get my dud of the game for Game 2. You pick Malphite B5 into Kennen, and you get destroyed because it's a really bad matchup for Malphite, and then you just go like, I wonder what I could have done. I don't know. Like, I don't really know what was supposed to happen this game. Robo played okay in Game 1 on the Renekton. This was just not a good game for him on the Malphite. Croc was miserable across this whole series. It really did feel like the second half of Game 1 just completely destroyed his mental, and he looked completely checked out. It looked a little bit better at the beginning, at the very least, of Game 1, but if you're mentally checked out at Worlds, don't pick Kazakhs. Like, you can't get away with that, right? Tinones was a lot worse in this game. I don't think he was particularly good in this series at all, especially in the isolated 1v1s. And I think a lot of people are saying that Root is kind of the savior and kind of the hard-stuck player here for Loud, but Root does what he's been doing all year for Loud and what he's been doing all his career, really, and that's be a good player that knows what to do with resources when he gets them, but isn't somebody that necessarily generates them on his own. He's not somebody that's going to dominate a 2v2. He's not a great laner, and he's not going to be able to do that on his own if Seos and Croc and Tinones aren't playing very aggressive and getting the team a lot of leads, and that was unfortunately the case in this series. He didn't make mistakes, but he also wasn't making the team better by being there, and so Loud definitely exposed, at the very least a little bit, and I think it's something to continue to monitor. There is potential for this team to not be as good the next time they face a team like GAM or face a team like R7. That definitely is possible, but again, they still have a lot of upside, and there was a reason they destroyed a team like GAM in round 1, because they are incredibly talented if they do get to the part of the game that they are most comfortable in. Hopefully they can look back on the tape from these last couple of games and really find an opportunity for them to learn and grow from it and get their mental back, most importantly, so that when they go into that next best of 3, they're playing maybe a little bit more controlled and a little bit more of the Loud style. But again, congratulations to PSG. Very, very big win for them. It puts them in a really good spot when it comes to, the best of 5s. They're going to be playing whoever comes out of the B side of the bracket in second place, which is always good. Not having to play the team that is the hottest is good, but it could line them up for a matchup against BDS, which wouldn't necessarily be ideal for them. Certainly something to monitor, but at least for now, PSG looks like and probably is the best team in the play-ins at the current moment. And now moving on to our second series here of day number 3. We already know one of the teams that's going to be coming out of this best of 3 stage, moving into that best of 5 stage as a number 1 seed. But now we're going to get to find out the second, because now we get to move over to the B side of the bracket. And on that side, we've got a matchup between the number 2 seed from the PCS and the CTBC Flying Oysters and the number 2 seed from the VCS and Team Wales. Very intriguing matchup. Certainly not the one I think most people were expecting to see here. BDS very much getting upset by Wales in that first round. I don't think a lot of people were anticipating that. I know I certainly wasn't. A major region going down this early. Certainly not on my bingo card, especially to a team like Team Wales that going into this tournament I had as the weakest team at Worlds. That was certainly not someone that I was looking out for and watching to see if they could overperform, but they've done just that. Granted, through the first 3 games, a very small sample size, I don't want to try to overreact, but they looked awesome in that series. A couple of their players in particular, I want to give a big shout out to Artemis, who is probably the player that I underestimated the most coming into this tournament. He is a really solid AD carry, and especially in a pool of ADCs down in the play-in stage that I think is, quite frankly, weaker than maybe some of the other roles. I think Artemis definitely has the opportunity to be one of the more interesting and carry-oriented ADCs down here, especially when he gets to play with someone like BA in the bot lane. They were fantastic in that series, really taking advantage of a lot of the mistakes that both Crowny and Labrov were making. Everybody who followed the primer knows I'm a big fan of Glory in the mid lane as well, and so there's reason for me to believe that Wales is better than I was giving them credit for at the beginning of this tournament. However, it is just 2 wins against BDS. BDS had a lot of problems and struggled a lot individually in those games, and so we can't just sit here and say that that success is going to translate into a matchup against a team like the Oysters, who are very good in their own right. Now, I don't think they're dominant. In fact, I think that they are one of the more teams at Worlds this year, for lack of a better term. They're just kind of good. They're not great, really, at anything. They're just solid. They're kind of PSG light, if you will, where I've been hyping up PSG for a long time in terms of their ability to play the late game, their ability to be consistent at team fights, and Oysters are very similar. They're very good in the team fight stage. They're a little bit more aggressive in the early game, but I don't think they're quite as consistent, and I do think that they could potentially be vulnerable. Now, in saying all that, I still would favor CFO in a series like this against Wales, if only because I do think they have slightly more talent. I think players like Xiaoxi and Shun and Jimmy have been really good over the course of the last few months, especially in the end of the PCS playoffs. And Wales, I just didn't have a ton of faith in them going into this tournament. But if there ever was going to be an upset, if there ever was going to be kind of one that I get wrong in the play-in stage, I'm more than willing to accept that this could be it. I think this is even closer on paper to what we just talked about in the PSG versus Loud series. And so it's going to be interesting, but of course we get to start with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was CFO. They are going to take the first game of the series. They're going to go up 1-0. It's a really important win, obviously, in best of threes. I talked about this before, but game 1 becomes infinitely more important because it just gives you an opportunity to close the game or close the series early, or alternatively, gives you the flexibility to potentially lose the game too, which is very nice to have, especially in a tournament like this where the meta isn't quite as clearly defined as it has been in recent months. But this was a really nice win for CFO. I really like their draft. I think it gives them quite a few different options. They get a lot of the power picks in the meta right now, and they truly do use them in a very, very good way. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me in game 1 is going to go to Xiaoxi. He's really been the star for CFO over the course of the last few months for me. I know a lot of people have been talking about Rest. I've seen some people talking about Jimmy in the solo lanes, but for me, Xiaoxi has definitely been the player that I've been the most impressed by. He was someone that I was kind of neutral on, basically for his entire tenure in the LPL, but now moving down to a little bit of a lesser region in the PCS, kind of going back home, going back to the region where he started his career and getting on a team that maybe doesn't have as much proactive playmaking as maybe some of the other LPL teams had. I think his playmaking instincts have brought a new life to how this team wants to play the game. Putting him on something like Rel, obviously it's incredibly strong right now. I'm not really sure why it fell all the way to second rotation. That's not something I would expect to continue to happen for this team because Xiaoxi is very good at a lot of these initiators. You know, Rel obviously is great, but even things like the Blitzcrank that we saw yesterday were very impactful. He's been fantastic. He is kind of the driver of the car, if you will. He's the one that pushes the cart forward, and I think this team really relies a lot on him to be able to make a lot of the big plays. But credit to Shun. I know I haven't really brought him up, especially wasn't like really high on him in the primer, but he's done a great job of capitalizing when the rest of the team is able to get him resources. It's not particularly easy to dominate in the mid game on Kalista, although I do like, you know, how this team is set up to scale into the late game. I think the mid game is probably the part of the game where you're going to be the most concerned, but that's where Shun really started to take over and where this game really started to get out of control. I loved the way that he was positioning. He was playing really aggressive, but not putting himself in positions where he could consistently be caught out by things like the Oyster or the Lee Sin. That's exactly where you want to be on a Kalista. Winning lane early, making sure those skirmishes in the mid game count, and, you know, getting your team a pretty big gold advantage. Obviously, credit to Gemini in the jungle on the Sejuani. I still think Sej is really good. We've seen a lot of people start to move towards some of these more aggressive junglers. We saw the Kazakhs in the previous series. We see the Lee Sin across from him in this series. I still think these tanky, engage-style junglers are probably going to be your most consistent across a tournament like this. And Sejuani definitely fits that mold. Gemini played it great. Pairing it up with something like an Orianna that can allow the Sej to play a little bit more aggressive, especially in the mid-game, I think is only a positive for the team. And of course, Rest also dominating on the top side of the map. Really everybody doing their job and everybody kind of making it work for the side of CFO. If they continue to play this way, if they continue to not only win early, which is obviously great, but put themselves in a position to even win when their comp isn't at its strongest, I think that's only going to be a massive positive for them moving into the future and the rest of the series. And then for Wales, on the other side, it's an okay game. You definitely had some moments and some player, performances, I think, that are encouraging, but I think as a whole, there are reasons to be concerned. And, again, they lost game 1 against BDS, so I'm not going to sit here and say that they can't turn this series around, but I think in particular, Sparta in the top lane, BA in the support position, these players kind of underperformed for me. Sparta's going to get my dud of the game here in game 1 on the Renekton. He wasn't really able to do much with that Renekton early on. It's a tough matchup in Nanar, and I think people are finding out that maybe R1 Renekton isn't quite as safe as maybe it was a couple of months ago, where it just kind of was good into every matchup and, gave you options to relatively scale into the late game. I don't think that that's, as much the case anymore. I think Renekton is definitely a little bit more vulnerable, and Sparta, I don't think, had a very good game. He lost early, wasn't able to transition any sort of pressure into the mid game, and then eventually just ran out of steam, which is obviously super unfortunate. But it's not like the rest of the team was really being super proactive. There were definitely moments where Gen.G and Glory in the jungle mid duo were moving around the map and trying to make things happen, but it always felt like the Oysters were just a little bit faster, a little bit more clean at these plays, and I think that's a big positive for them. Artemis still continues to be very good. The Aphelios didn't really have a lot of opportunities in this game to actually do anything. He was just kind of waiting for a team fight to break out, and it never really did. By the time the team fight stage did end up hitting, he was super far behind, and the rest of the team was super far behind, and there really wasn't a lot of ways to salvage that game. But I think players like Artemis and Gen.G played relatively well. Glory had some good moments outside of the int in the back half of the game, but Sparta and BA were definitely questions. Sparta was definitely a concern for me going into Worlds. He was my last ranked top laner at the tournament, and I like BA. In fact, I've actually given him a lot of credit for how good Artemis has played over the past few months, but this wasn't a particularly good Oyster performance. The champion was not really tanky in the back half of the game. Not that that's entirely his fault, but he was folding and he didn't really accomplish anything, which is always going to be not ideal, if you will. But, you know, Wales, they've shown they can come back from a deficit before. They've done it in the VCS as well. This was not a team that dominated their way to Worlds. They had to overcome a lot of different struggles. They're going to need to do the same thing again here in this series because it's a best of 3. Losing game 1 means you have to win both of the final 2 games back to back, and that's a tough challenge against a team like the Oysters, but Wales can do it. But are they going to be able to kick that off with game number 2, or is CFO going to be able to close out this series relatively easily with a sweep? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Team Wales. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and obviously this is a massive win for this team because it keeps this series alive. I know, you know, a lot of people had some hype and some hope around this team after they took down BDS in the first round, but I think a win over a team like the Flying Oysters that were at Worlds last year, you know, obviously have proven to at the very least be a competitive team at this level, and with PSG doing so well from the same region on the other side of the bracket, for Wales to come into a series like this and, you know, look really good and be able to pick up a win and honestly kind of just outplay them in game number 2, it's crazy impressive. You got to give them a lot of credit for that. So big ups to Wales. I think the thing that was the most impressive about this game in comparison to what they were doing in the previous one was just the specifics of how they stepped up. I think a lot of the 1v1 or 2v2 lanes really went in their favor, and obviously I think this draft is a lot more meta appropriate, if you will. A lot more strong picks in the meta right now going over to the side of Wales, like the Jarvan, like the Nico, like specifically the Cassante that we've seen be easily the best top laner at the tournament at the moment. And that's really where I want to focus my conversation to start here. Player of the game is going to go to Sparta, and honestly, Sparta was somebody that I think is just a bit more inconsistent than maybe I was giving him credit for, in a good way, where I was kind of just saying he was a little bit of a weak side, kind of nothing special player that lost a lot 1v1 in the PCS. I wasn't really giving him, or the VCS I should say, I wasn't really giving him a lot of credit, especially because it felt like there were other top laners in the region that were doing so well with how highly I ranked someone like Kiaya. But I think that might have just been a little bit of an overreaction to the fact that he didn't do well against a top laner that I really like in Kiaya, because he's actually been pretty decent. At least in their wins, he's looked pretty good when he has won at this tournament. Now, that's not to say he's had all good games, that he hasn't had any bad ones. We talked about that yesterday. He got destroyed by Adam in game 1. And he had a really bad game in game 1 of this series as well against Rest. But, you know, for him to be able to bounce back and be the player of the game in game 2 and be really good like he was in game 3 a couple of days ago or yesterday, that was really, really solid from him. And it goes to show that, you know, he probably is a player that deserves at least a little bit more respect than what I was giving him at the beginning of this tournament, because, you know, it was really good. The Cassante was really solid. I think Cassante in general is just so broken. It's hard for me to give a ton of specifics about what Sparta did because a lot of it was just Cassante things, right? Being able to win lane even though you're in a counterpick matchup, being able to dominate team fights even though you don't really have the stats typically to be able to do that with the items that you've built. Sparta was just really strong, and a lot of that is the champion, but we've seen a lot of players not execute on Cassante, so do want to give him credit for that. Other players that you really want to shout out here, Artemis was great again. He continues to be a really big positive point for this team, and honestly, Artemis is really selling me as a player, and I'm starting to believe in him as potentially one of the best ADCs in the play-in stage. Certainly one of the top 3, and I did not believe that going into the tournament, so really happy to see that. He had something crazy, like 400 CS at 30 minutes, or at least around that, somewhere in the vicinity, 10 or so CS off, but I mean, even being in the proximity of that is absurd. On something like Xayah, obviously they're going to win this lane. Xayah Rakan into Kai'Sa Blitzcrank is very Xayah favored, but Artemis to be able to dominate like that and get to the late game and not just farm up, not just have that CS and get a bunch of gold and never do anything with it, but really capitalize in the back half of the game at being able to deal damage very, very consistently. Great stuff from him. BA was a lot better on the Rakan, criticized him a lot in game 1. This was definitely a better performance from the support. This bot lane has honestly been clicking across this entire tournament up until this point. Game 1 was not indicative of how good BA has been for this Team Wales team, even just domestically in the VCS. I think Artemis and BA are great. Glory probably had his first game where he really showed a lot of what I was talking about in the tape, where I said he was the best mid laner in Vietnam. I still believe that. He was awesome domestically, was super fun to watch in the playoffs, and this is really the first game where you're like, oh, he's getting out on the map, he's consistently winning isolated 1v1 trades against an Ahri, and he's more active in terms of the roams, which is very deadly and very difficult to deal with. And then, of course, Gen.G, I think, played well on the Jarvan, which really just kind of ties everything together. This was just a nice win for Wales, and, I think basically every player on the team stepped up to keep this part of the series alive. And then for the Oysters, obviously you can afford to lose game 2 after losing game 1, but you don't want to give over momentum in a game like this where you do honestly just kind of look like the worst team. And I'm not going to say you are the worst team, but Wales looked awesome, and you didn't have any answers to that in this game. A couple of counter picks that didn't even necessarily go your way. We're looking at the Gwen on R5 in the top lane going into the Cassante. I've said this all year long. In fact, longtime viewers of the channel are probably tired of hearing this, but Gwen is a quote-unquote counter to Cassante. Like, I get the idea behind Gwen being strong into Cassante, but if Cassante actually plays aggressive and gets that pressure early, especially if jungle spends some time up there, Gwen is not going to be able to fight him from behind. Like, there is not a circumstance where she's actually going to be able to duel him if Cassante does get a lot of the resources, and that's what happened this game. Rest was just trying to make too many aggressive plays after the game had already gotten out of control. I don't love Gwen in this current situation. I know a lot of people are talking about her as a flex pick after some of the jungle changes, but, I think this game goes to show why she's a little bit overrated as a pick at the moment. I think you're kind of looking at some contrasting styles in the rest of this draft. You go for things like Lee Sin and Ahri that want to be out on the map and certainly want to be making plays early and specifically in the mid game, but you go for something like a Kai'Sa in the bot lane that, yes, can help and assist those plays, but isn't necessarily going to be able to capitalize on them nearly as well as some other AD carries, and especially going into something like Xayah, you're just never going to have Prio in the bot lane, even with Xiaoxi's Blitzcrank. And yes, credit to Xiaoxi, I still think he's really good on Blitzcrank. It's a signature pick for a reason, but there's only so many plays you can make when you're down 5k gold. There's only so many hooks that actually are going to be viable when Wales is grouping up and putting themselves in a good position. There really aren't a lot of priority targets on the other side of the map. You don't want to hook the Cassante. You don't want to hook the Jarvan. There's really not a lot of great, targets to be able to get as long as Wales plays it well. And so even if Xiaoxi, I think, was positioning well, there isn't just a ton he can do. I think in general, like I said, everybody was just kind of outclassed. This wasn't a very good performance from CFO, and, I'm going to sit here and chalk it up to saying it's just game 2. You dominated game 1. You put yourself in a good spot. You were really good in round 1 of this tournament as well, and, you still have the potential to be able to just kind of right the ship, clear your mental, get back on the Rift in game 3, and show all the good things, but Wales definitely has the momentum going into the final game. They reverse swept BDS. They could very well do that again to CFO here, but obviously, game 3 super important. Whoever wins this next game will be done with the best of 3 stage. They will move in to the best of 5 stage as the number 1 seed out of the B side of the bracket. Who is it going to be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Team Wales. They are going to do it. They're going to take game number 3. They're going to close out this series with a 2-1 win, and that is back-to-back upsets for them to make their way out of the B bracket as the number 1 seed. I did not see this coming at all at the beginning of the tournament. I could not have predicted this, no matter how well this team played. It's, definitely the easier side of the bracket. That I will definitely give them, and BDS was probably the tougher opponent out of the 2 that they faced, but what they have proven here today is that was not an upset victory. That was not a flash in the pan. That was not something that you can discount as a single performance. This is a good Team Wales team that definitely has to be respected. They have a couple of players that I think have really showed up at this international tournament, and ones that I think are going to be tough for basically any team on the other side of the bracket to go into. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole for me is once again going to go to Artemis in the bot lane. He just is that dude right now for Wales. I don't know if I just didn't see it. I don't know if he's completely changed from his domestic performance to his modern performance, but what we're getting out of Artemis right now across these last 6 games has been better than anything that I've seen from him in 2023. And I know obviously he was great in 2022. A player that was on the rise from an international perspective, someone that we got a lot of, positive feedback on, and definitely was a player that a lot of people were starting to get to know, but it did feel for a lot of people like 2023 was a bit of a step down in terms of what he was able to accomplish individually, but just increase the quality of the game, I guess. Just let him go against better opponents and he'll get locked in and he'll show up and really perform like he did in this series. He has been awesome. He got Kai'Sa in this game, which is obviously a little bit of a cheat code in the current meta. I still think Kai'Sa is very good, even if I do think that it's a tough matchup into Xayah. It's the reason I think Xayah is very highly prioritized and why I, understand the idea of going Xayah on B1 instead of Kai'Sa. But Kai'Sa's still really strong. If she gets to the part of the game where she can actually get online and deal a lot of that damage, there's just no ADC in the game right now that's going to do nearly as much, even after the changes. In fact, like I said, I think that the modern Kai'Sa build is even more, broken, even more deadly than any of the variable of builds that she could have gone a couple of patches ago. Really like where she's at in terms of strength. I don't think it's good for the game, but I think it's very good if you're going to be able to get her early on in the rotation, and Artemis proved that. But his positioning, his aggressiveness in particular is just, it's sensational. It's fantastic. He's one of the most aggressive AD carries at this tournament, and it pays off for him very, very consistently almost every time. Really good stuff. Love what he's been able to do. He's going to make this team relevant in basically any game. BA was also really good on the Nautilus. You can talk about Kai'Sa being, really strong all you want, but she had to get some help getting there no matter what, and BA was a big reason for that. A couple of really solid games down the backstretch of this series. I'm high on BA. I like him as a player. I've liked him for a couple of years now. And I think we're starting to see kind of the good parts of him come out. He's a very good engager, not someone that is going to be prone to ridiculous amounts of mistakes, which we do see from a lot of the supports at this tournament, because that's just kind of the meta, is kind of those more aggressive plays, even if it costs you at times. But BA is very consistent. He's going to give you good performances, and I do still think he's one of the better players on this team, even though the floor of this team has gone up quite a bit. But Glory is another player that you have to point out. Really happy to see that my, analysis and take on him at the beginning of the tournament is coming true. This is probably some of the best analysis I gave, at least in terms of the play-in teams, was my prediction on what Glory was going to be able to do here, because he's been sensational. And I think that Team Wales really does value his production a lot. I think that obviously he's not the flashiest player in the world, but the Orianna in this game, 10-4 and 10, that's a scary Orianna, and his scoreline looks better than everybody else's in the game, but I just don't think his impact was nearly as much as the Kai'Sa, especially in the mid game where it felt like, Kai'Sa was just dealing a ridiculous amount of damage. Ori was obviously super impactful, and I think when you pair Ori up with something like a Jarvan that is really strong, I start to feel a little bit better as an early pick. Obviously, I'm a little bit lower on Ori in the current meta. I think she's fine. I just, a lot of people are hyping her up as the #1 mid laner. I just don't see it. I don't see the explosive potential that you have in champions like Jace or Tristana or even in Azir, right? I think they just give you a little bit more upside if everything goes right, but Ori's going to be incredibly stable. She's a little bit slow, but if you do hit that late game, if you do hit that team fight stage, she's going to be very difficult to deal with, and she makes everybody else on the team better, which is obviously very, very good. BJ was awesome across this whole series. I think Broadcast ended up giving him player of the series. I think that's a little bit of an overreaction. I think he was good. I don't think he was the one that was actively creating, although he did set a ton up for the Orianna. In particular, this game, a big reason why Ori and Glory on Ori, that's funny, was able to get super far ahead in this one was because the Jarvan was very active, moving around in the mid game, making plays. This is how you got to play Jarvan. Talked about it. Essentially, it's funny. He was going into Vi. I consider Jarvan the new age Vi, or at least the modern version of what we've gotten out of Vi over the last couple of years, where you want to play aggressive early. You want to put your team in a position where you can push further forward and not necessarily rely a ton on your scaling, because you need to have gold going into the late game or else you're going to be too squishy. I think it's very similar, but a ton of early game pressure coming in, and then obviously Sparta was really good in this game as well. On the Aatrox, Wales was just really, really fun to watch, and I think in general, you have to watch out for them now. You can no longer underestimate what Wales is as a team, because they have proven that they are capable of taking down even some of the more interesting teams at this tournament of higher quality regions in the PCS and the LEC. So really good stuff from them. And then for the Oysters, on the other side. It's a frustrating loss. I think you definitely wanted to come out of this group as number one. You didn't go into the group probably expecting that, but as soon as BDS lost in the first round, you probably considered yourself favorites for this group. You weren't able to get the job done like your regional counterpart on the other side of the map with PSG, but still, this is an okay series, and this was a very close game. I don't want it to seem like this was some sort of blowout. I know I didn't necessarily hype up the Oysters all that much, but this is the closest game of Worlds by a pretty large margin. This Game 3 was really, really fun to watch. And a lot of that was because I think the mid-jungle duo was really good in this. I think Jimmy in particular on the Azir really created a lot of problems for Wales, and they actually had trouble dealing with his damage in the late game. It's crazy what an Azir can do if he doesn't continuously try to look for playmaking opportunities with the Shreem and Shuffle and get himself into bad predicaments, and just instead he sits on the backline and does a ton of damage. That champion is still really good. I know that everybody wants to try to be the hero when they play Azir, but if you're going to consistently sit on the backline, you're probably going to be more useful in more games that way, but good stuff from him. I think Shun was fine this series. You know, Rest was okay. I think he obviously had a really bad game too. He wasn't really all that impactful on the Renekton here in Game 3. And Gemini, I think his scoreline looks good. He made a couple of awesome plays, especially in the mid game here on the Vi, being able to create opportunities, being able to set up specifically like the Xayah and the Azir to create. But unfortunately, he made some bad ones, especially in the team fighting stage. We've seen this out of Vi's in recent, weeks, especially at Worlds so far. It feels like someone is mind controlling all these Vi players to ult the Jarvan in these team fights, and you really don't need to do that. You really need to ult the Kai'Sa. You really, really need to ult the Kai'Sa, but it's okay. Gemini, I'm sure will learn from it. Xiaoxi's going to get my dead of the game in the support position. I've been hyping him up. I do still think he's probably the best player on this team, but when you're playing Rel from a situation where she doesn't have any gold and everybody else on the enemy team has a lot of mobility, it's really hard to actually stick and not die super fast. That's the problem with Rel that I've talked about all year long. Again, another thing that I've repeated on this channel very extensively, but for those who are joining the channel that are new for Worlds, what I've said about Rel is that you better win early, because if you're playing Rel from behind, you go in and you do all your CC and you lock them down and nobody on your team has the damage to kill anybody and you're super squishy and you just die. And that's going to happen with Rel if you don't play her super aggro. And, it's a little bit better in the support position, but unfortunately for Xiaoxi, he just was in a position where a lot of his engages, especially down the stretch of this game, were just non-factors. They were just completely unimpactful. And that's going to happen. He's going to get dead of the game just because he was the most active in terms of not doing anything, but I really don't think anybody on CFO played bad in Game 3. It's certainly not a lot of these other performances like we've gotten from teams like BDS or even Loud earlier in the video where it was like, okay, you just kind of got outclassed in a do-or-die game. No, I think CFO really put up a good fight, and it does go to show that maybe this team does have, expectations and a possibility to still get out of this group. I know a lot of people have just assumed that BDS is going to be able to grab this number 2 seed, but CFO looked good here, and it's going to be an interesting matchup if that is on the table. But congratulations to Wales. They are done with the best of 3 stage. They only have one more series to potentially get them out of the play-in stage and into the group stage of the World Championships. And as the number 2 seed from the VCS in Vietnam, where the number 1 seed has already disappointed so much on the other side of the bracket, it's just incredibly impressive stuff, and one that I think Wales is definitely going to be proud of. All right, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2023 Day 3 overview and analysis video. We covered the 2 winners finals, upper bracket finals, if you will, for both Bracket A and Bracket B. We know the first 2 teams that have qualified for the play-in finals, of course, PSG Talon from Group A, Team Wales from Group B. Very, very interesting. PSG was expected. They were predicted by me and a lot of other people to come out of that group in a good spot, but Wales obviously has overperformed a ton, and I'm really happy to see them there. But who is going to be joining them? That's certainly going to be an interesting conversation. Tomorrow, on Day 4, we have 2 matchups to determine the first 2 teams that will be eliminated from Worlds 2023 on the A side. Of course, GAM taking on R7, both of those teams losing in round 1. Very interesting matchup. I think if GAM plays the way that they did against Loud in the first round, they're doomed. Like, they looked really bad in that series. And I don't think R7 is a pushover team at all, but specifically the bot lane of GAM was really bad against Loud, and I like the bot lane of R7, so especially Seo. I really think he's a very interesting player to watch. I'm not going to go as far as saying that R7 should be favorites, but I'm actually going to predict the upset here. I think R7 is going to be able to pick up the win. I know not a lot of people are going to go for that one, but I think it's still very close, almost 50-50 for me. I think it's basically a split, but I actually value what I've seen out of R7. I think they played the better team, and I think they have some upside with players like Mireu and Seo that I really like, and I just don't know if I feel the same way about Gam, especially if Slater performs that way. However, I still think Kiaya is awesome in the top lane, and they still have a ton of flexibility with the rest of that roster. Levy, Kati, they're very good players, and they're certainly good enough, but I think the bot lane's just a little bit too big of a weakness in a meta where that matters right now. So I'm going to go with R7 on that one. And then on the other side, BDS taking on Detonation Focus Me. This one's easier to predict. DFM is the worst team at this tournament. They are very clearly just not good enough to be here. They've made a roster change right before this tournament, putting in a top laner who hasn't played competitively in 2 years, and their bot lane didn't look nearly as good as they did domestically. It feels like their jungler is just not in good form. DFM is not in a good spot, and BDS should be able to destroy them. Now, BDS also completely underperformed against Wales, but as we've seen, Wales is actually a pretty good team, so something to keep an eye out for. I would expect BDS to easily sweep this. This should be a no-brainer 2-0. Much, much clearer than the other side of the bracket, but I would predict BDS and maybe surprisingly R7 to be the teams that move on. Although, again, if GAM wins, I'm not going to be surprised. I would be stunned if DFM won. That would be a big upset, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Would love to know your thoughts on those two series. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and of course, it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about Worlds every single day that there is games on this channel, whether it's day 1, whether it's day 30. We're going to be posting about it on this channel. If you want comprehensive coverage from somebody who has covered all 4 of the major regions all year long and has watched all of the playoffs for the minor regions, there's just no other place on YouTube that you're going to get that. Hit subscribe and hit that bell, especially if you already enjoyed the video. It really would mean a lot, and I want you guys to be notified when those videos do end up going live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.